Yeah, so we're going through discipleship metrics, and really discipleship is such a core and important part of who we are as a church. It's really investing in somebody's life and walking along with people as we walk after Jesus. I can't talk, but as we walk after Jesus, they walk with us. And in a lot of places we see discipleship defined kind of loosely, but like we at our church just try to make it look like what we see Jesus do, like we see Paul and Timothy do, like we see just the people in the Bible who walk with each other. But it's also really hard just to figure that out and do it. So we put together this whole discipleship metrics thing that you can get on our website. Just go to livingfaithindy.com and click discipleship. And there's like an online assessment you can take to kind of figure out where you're at and the person that you're discipling, where they're at, just to get it on a piece of paper, not to figure out like how good you are or how good they like or anything, but just see like where there's growth needed. And there's a lot of growth needed. And to be as transparent as possible, the one that's actually on that page is mine. So you can see where I'm broken and where I need help. We change it to like funny words on there that no one notices, but just because I like Easter eggs. But still, like there's something good about just figuring out where we are and figuring out how we can move forward. So in this sermon series, we're going through all these different metrics, and today we're on the last metric, which is leadership development. So the leadership development side is specifically pinpointing your calling of what God's calling you to, how you lead in the church, and then also dealing with conflict. Now, leadership is kind of a heavy-handed word because I feel like half of us, when we hear leadership, we get excited and we're like, leadership, like, yes, let's move forward. And then half of us are like, heck no, I want nothing to do with leadership. Like, why would I want to be a leader? But leadership isn't like scary. You know, I totally see why we get that. I totally see why we kind of lean towards it feeling scary because our whole culture, I feel like, has leadership upside down. You know, when we look at what leadership is in the non-Christian world or in the non-church world, often leadership is this big, scary, in-your-face, like rule with an iron fist kind of feel, you know? If you Google the world's best leaders or just famous leaders, the list is terrifying. The list is like Winston Churchill, Martin Luther King Jr., Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler, Abraham Lincoln, Julius Caesar, Joseph Stalin, and Nelson Mandela. So you have, when you look at leader, you have everything from MLK, who was like probably the best representation of Jesus to our culture that we've had in generations, all the way to Adolf Hitler, who is probably the best representation of Satan to our world in generations. And both of them were incredible leaders. Good or bad people, like off to the side, let's just look at their leadership ability. They're both incredible leaders. And when we look at that, like it totally makes sense why people would look at those people and be like, I don't want to be a leader. Or I don't think that that's for me, and I don't think I could do that, you know? Or, I mean, Napoleon maybe, but everyone else, like, like looking at stuff like that, I know. Not as a person, I mean, just like, if he can do it, I could, yeah. Like when we look at these things, we get such a false sense of what leadership really is. And we end up getting this like, I'm going to grit my teeth and I'm going to push people to do what I want them to do. And nowhere in Scripture do we see that as healthy leadership. You know, healthy leadership is the opposite of that. I think if we look at the definition of leadership, it makes it a little bit more like palpable, okay? So the definition of leadership is this: the action of leading a group of people. Right? Like, that is deep. I know, that is really, really deep. And that's it. Like, worship team, you guys can come back now. Like that's what leadership is. It's just leading people. And I think what that means is that having a big title is possible, is good. You know, you can have a title and lead. You can have a lot of power. You can have like a really well-respected job. You can have all those things and still be a terrible leader. You could also have none of those things and be an incredible leader. You know, you can be somebody who doesn't have a respected job or a job at all. You can be somebody who doesn't have any power that anyone can point at, and you don't have a title or anything like that. But if people follow you, you're a leader, right? And I feel like in this world today, we have this really weird upside down view of what leadership is. And it's the person who commands big groups, and it's the person who demands that people follow them in this way, and the person who's like, my way or the highway, this is what it looks like, you don't do this, you're fired. And that's not leadership, that's like controlling stake in your life, you know? Leadership is, hey guys, look at this incredible thing that we could be doing, let's go. Let's do this. Like, that's leadership. That's what it really looks like. So that said, I think what leadership really is influence. It's the ability to really harness influence. And influence is this is the definition. It's the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone. So the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of a person. So if leadership is just influence, what that actually means is that every single Christian should be a leader. To some level, to some amount, with some people, every single person listening right now should be a leader. Now, we all have different giftings, we have different callings, and we'll get to that in a minute. And if every single person in the church was a leader in the church, it wouldn't work. But we all are leaders in some facet in our lives, right? And what that means is, like, if you are discipling somebody, you're a leader. Like, if you meet with somebody and they listen to the words coming out of your mouth and they try to change their life because of it, you are a leader. And if you post something on social media and people respond to it, you're a leader. If you post things on social media and no one responds to it, you're just a crazy person. But if they, not really, but if they follow you, if they hang on your words, you're a leader. If you are somebody who doesn't speak often, but when you do speak, the room stops and listens. And this morning, and I said this on the west side, I pointed out PJ, and I was like, that's who PJ is. Like, he doesn't talk much, but when he does, everyone's quiet. Because they're like, oh, he's speaking. Like, that's influence. That's leadership. And when you coach somebody and they make changes in their lives, you're a leader. If you have kids at all, you're a leader. Because they're literally hardwired to listen to you. And then as they get older, to not listen to you. But there's still leadership involved in that. If you have people who copy the things that you do in life, you're a leader, whether you're telling them to do them also or not. If they are following you, if they're listening to that influence, you're a leader. If you have the ability to clearly explain vision and people get on board and they're like, I want that too, like, that's leadership. And at the end of the day, we have this verse. I don't know if you've heard this verse before. It's kind of a deep cut in the New Testament. But there's this verse talking all about the influence that we should have as Christians. It's Matthew 28:19 and 20. It says, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you.
That's a real insight.
I know, right? It's pretty in your face, right?
Yeah.
We've all heard that 100 times. Like, we've heard this Great Commission, and I think we often look at that as like just this overarching, like, oh, we're supposed to do that. But this is literally for you. You are supposed to be a person of influence. You are supposed to go out into your life and be a leader among the people that you're with. The people that you work with should look at you as the best example of what it looks like to do your job. You know? The people that see you on the street, when they see the way you live your life, they're like, I want that. Like, that is influence, that is leadership. And every single one of us are called to live out this leadership and to actually, like, be this leader. And I think a lot of times, one of the biggest things I think the enemy wants to do to Christians is to be like, you're a follower, just follow. But we're the ones who change culture, you know? When you look in the New Testament and you see the people who followed Jesus, they changed everything. They walked out in the world and said, we're not doing it this way anymore. God changed the rules. This is what it looks like. You know, God is the one who calls the shots. This is what I'm living for. And it was influential to the point where it changed the entirety of the earth. quickly. If you look at human history and how just this Christian revolution took over, it's because God was behind it and these people were leaders. They stepped out in influence. So the hard part of this, though, I think one of the things that we need to really look into is where we're leading, right? Because earlier we talked about MLK and Hitler, right? Both incredible leaders. Different directions, right? Like, think about the Hitler thing for a second. Like, anytime I talk about leadership, I talk about Hitler because it's easier to lead in something that's good than something that's horrible. And Hitler was an absolutely terrible human being, but he's one of the best leaders that we've ever seen because he took a terrible concept and got his whole country to fall for it. Like, he led his entire country down a terrible path and then got the entire region to agree with him and then got other countries to elect leaders like him to support him to try and take over the world because of his own crazy thing inside of his head. Obviously, we don't want to do that, but that's leadership, like the amount of influence that he had. And I want to say, like, as we start talking about our calling, as we start talking about how we serve in the church, leadership is not enough. Calling and character matters so much more. Because I want to make sure I say this right, exceptional leadership ability can just as easily harm the kingdom of God as it can help it. And we've all seen pastors who are self-righteous jerks who just want to run their own direction and want to lead and want to make a statement and want to like cause waves in the Christian community, and I'm going to do this and you're going to follow me and I'm a leader. And exceptional leadership can take you either great places or horrible places, but obedience always builds the kingdom. When we are able to look at God and say, what is it you want me to do? I'm in. I don't care how good of a leader you are or how bad of a leader you are. When you choose obedience, it goes well. And then after obedience, we work on leadership ability to be able to take the thing he told us to do better, to take it to higher places. But calling has to come first before leadership. So leadership's important. Hear me, be influential, but figure out what God's calling you to first, because otherwise you could very well be working against him, not for him. And the last thing I want to do is be a really good leader who leads us directly away from Jesus. And every single one of us have that as one of the options. No matter what level of leadership you're in, whether you're influential over a couple people or hundreds of people, lead towards Jesus. And I think that starts with calling. And the idea of calling is one of these things that I think just talking about what God is calling me to is another one of those like fear things, Like when you talk about calling, it's like, okay, what's that look like, And we start thinking like 40 years down the road. When you hear calling, you're like, what am I going to do when I'm 65 years old or 80 years old or 20 years old? Like you start thinking way in the future beyond the number of years that you have. And you start thinking like, okay, what is this going to look like? And while that is not wrong, I think most of the time he's not going to give us something 40 years down the road. And if he is, you probably don't want to hear it anyway. Like if you're going to hear something like that, it's going to make the road different and probably harder. So my experience with calling and what I see in Scripture again and again is there's kind of two different parts to calling. There's like the direction of what God is calling you to, and then there's the specific role he uses to achieve that thing. And sometimes you get one or not the other. Usually you get a direction before you get the specific role. I think a lot of times if we get the specific role, we forget about the direction and we just try to achieve this and we get it all out of whack. So in my story, just to kind of illustrate this a little bit, when I was 18, God gave me a very specific calling to reach people with the gospel who were like the most broken people, the people that no one else wanted to pursue. And we were in England for a little while doing this, and like going after the people that all the other churches were like, they're not worth it. And I'm like, oh, they're the ones. I'm going there. And God broke my heart for that and just gave me this direction of like, they are worth my entire life. The hardest of hard people, they're the ones I want to go after. And that was a great direction for my life. And at 18, I had no clue what to do with it. at all. But when I was 23, we were back in the U.S. and God had very specifically given Autumn and I a direction to just pastor and love those broken people at this college campus that we were working at, IUPUI. And we really started pouring into the people that were right in front of us. And God specifically gave me the specific role of leading this college church. And we loved it. We loved investing in them. All of a sudden, this direction of broken people and hard people had a role connected to it that I was able to tangibly touch. So then a little while later, when I was 28, God called me to plant churches. And there was no question in prayer that God was speaking this. It took a long time to get it. This was not an overnight thing, but he really spoke I want you to plant churches. I want you to keep planting and planting and planting. And I was like, okay, great. So you've got this specific role of pastoring at this college church, this thing called Living Faith. And then you also gave me this thing to plant churches. So I guess I'm going to stop this Living Faith thing and go plant churches. And in a lot of prayer, we felt like God said, no, do both. And I'm like, you don't understand what you said before, because those don't work, Yeah, I know. You can't possibly, not understand how those don't work together, God. Yeah, I'm an idiot. So I had the direction of church planting, but also the specific role of pastor in Living Faith. And I tried as hard as I could just to do those things and just to live out those callings. And some of you guys were there for some of those years, and they were awkward. But then around 32, I finally understood what he meant 4 years earlier. And he really started to break our hearts for planting this location, for planting Irvington, for planting the next one and the next one. And I realized that pastoring Living Faith was planting again and again and again. And I just didn't have the vision for that. I just didn't have the ability to see that yet. And I just needed to kind of be faithful in the midst of it. So then he gave me this specific role in that of raising up and pastoring leaders, pastoring pastors who pastor people. And that specific role is something I'm still trying to kind of work out and trying to figure out. And now that I'm 36, I haven't gotten any more calling. I haven't gotten any more direction or any different direction. So I'm just being faithful in the last thing he said. And I will continue to be faithful in the last thing he said until he says something else. And that's simple. That's it. That's calling. I didn't need the angel Gabriel to open up and be like, thus saith the Lord, go to Iraq. No, some people might have that. He gave me little snippets and I'm just faithful with them. And as I've been faithful with them, I've seen him unravel into the specificity of what he actually had planned, which is such a cool thing. So my plea for you is this, as we talk about calling, is don't be so caught up in the role that you'll have in the future that you miss what God has for you now. But also, don't be so caught up in where you are today that you're not working towards what God has for you in the future. Both can be the same. Both can be good, And the last thing I want to see is God speak some mission field to you and drop something in your heart where you're like, oh my gosh, Peru, this place is breaking my heart. I'm going on a mission trip there. I basically want to live there and we're going to get there. And have that be so deep in your heart that you're like, I don't need to lead life group anymore. We're done. I don't need to work. We're going to live there. And you miss everything here today. But I also don't want anyone to be like, but I'm leading life group. I can't pray about Peru. What are you telling me? No, it's good. It's good to live kind of in both worlds and work towards your calling while being faithful in your current calling. And I think you'll look back and be like, oh, those were one calling. I didn't realize this was the training field for that. And we see that all throughout Scripture. Specifically with the story of Paul and Timothy and the way that Paul invested in Timothy, I think usually we see it completely from Paul's point of view, where we're like, okay, so Paul found this weird, awkward teenager and walked with him for a while, and he's like a son to him because they spend a lot of time in campgrounds and things. And then eventually he's like, you can go to Ephesus. And then he wrote him letters. He's like, I like you a lot. I don't know why he was typing, but you get the idea. So we think about it from that point of view, but think about it from Timothy's point of view. Timothy throughout the entire thing was just faithful. He just did what God called him to do, not really knowing what it was supposed to be. And We see at the beginning of this thing in Acts 16:3, it says, Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was Greek. So that's not really like a specific role. That's just a direction of like, follow Paul. Also for guys in the room, be really happy with whatever God's called you to, because his calling was to get circumcised as an adult, which I cannot imagine was super fun. It could be worse. So somewhere in this process of following Paul, he starts getting used for all these really cool things, and Paul kind of starts training him up in the stuff that he's doing. And he actually starts it's kind of like a see what I do, and then I want you to go do it, and I'll watch you, and then I'll give you some feedback, and we'll work it through. And we even see in Acts 19 where Paul sends him out to the Macedonians to serve them. And on this short-term thing, he's like, Timothy can take care of this. Timothy, go help the Macedonians. And all he's doing specifically is following Paul in this time, but you can see God kind of working him into this role of leading leaders, of leading these people. His specific role at this point is just assisting Paul. He's literally helping him set up tents. He's literally just taking care of issues with him. And I bet you Paul was praying for somebody. He's like, hey, that guy needs prayed for, do that. And they're just literally living life together and doing this. And this whole time his specific role is assisting Paul, but also God's building this direction of investing in leaders. And then a little while later, we see that Paul eventually does send Timothy to Ephesus, and he has the specific role of pastoring all of the churches in an entire region. Think about that. It's not like he was Living Faith Ephesus, there's 30 people there, they're yours. He sent him to Ephesus, and because of the investment that he had gotten from Paul, the entire church of Ephesus was like, we're looking to you, Timothy. A guy who was young, who we don't really know what he had to offer except that he had had years with Paul walking out this calling. And I think that just makes me think what if Timothy was so obsessed with his future calling in Ephesus that he missed everything that God wanted to do while walking with Paul? What if he missed all of those missionary journeys? What if he missed all of those cities, all of those people, all of those things that God wanted to do, all of the things that we just talked about in Acts earlier this year? So many of those were literally, Timothy had his hand on those people. What if he ignored those because Ephesus one day? It wouldn't have been good. Now, what if Timothy was so obsessed with what he was doing right now that he wasn't even willing to look towards the future, and he just decided not to follow Paul to begin with? We wouldn't even know his name, right? We wouldn't even know who Timothy is, and that honestly just makes me think, how many more Timothys were there that we've never heard of because they said no? I guarantee you, it's not like we're batting 100 and everyone we know in the Bible was the only person that was asked to go. I think there's a lot of people that said no, that were afraid of their calling and weren't willing to go. So the core of what it looks like to find your calling or to live out your calling is just to be obedient, we're not trying to be the best leaders in the world. Yes, work on leadership ability, work on being worthy of being followed, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But so much of this is just obedience and realizing that there is no hierarchy when it comes to leading in the church. It's just following Jesus. And it's just operating in our current calling. So for a lot of us who are listening right now, a lot of us in this room or watching online, for a lot of us, that leadership actually will come down to leading in the church. Now, for a lot of people, it's not that, and that's good. That's okay. I think there are definitely people who are called to lead in the church and people who aren't, but this in this room, our church is the training ground for leadership. This is where you figure it out. And this is where we hit our heads against the wall again and again and again. And that's great. There's grace for it here. Let's work on that together. So leading in the church, though, I think can be the same thing, where we can either look towards our future calling and ignore what God wants us to do here to learn it, or we can look so much here that we ignore our future calling because we're busy. And it makes me think about a guy named Dallas Jenkins, who wrote and put together this thing called The Chosen. Have you guys heard of that? So The Chosen is a really cool video series kind of talking about the life of Jesus. And Dallas Jenkins was actually on staff at a church called Harvest Bible Chapel. And he was on like the executive staff. And if you've been around mega churches at all, I've nothing but respect for so many mega churches. But also I know a lot where you can be on staff at the mega church and kind of just like not do your job and no one really calls you on it because like it's just kind of like a big heavy culture. So it's very possible that Dallas Jenkins could have just kept doing his job day to day and never like thought about future stuff, never thought about future calling. But in the middle of that, God called him to put together this film series. And his whole thing was, I want to make something that's not terrible because everything made for Christians is terrible. And God called him to this thing, and he could have sat in his current calling and ignored the future calling that he was being prepared for. But because he didn't, now there's thousands of people who have given their lives to Jesus. Yeah. But what if he would have been like, I don't need to work at a church. God's calling me to make this film series. And he didn't have the biblical backing to do it right. And he didn't have the heart of what God wanted to do through it to do it right. And he was just like, I'm going to stick it to the man Hollywood style and make something better. That's not the right heart either, you know? And I think in this whole thing, like, we need to be thinking like that temporary and the longer scale, you know, of like, what's my specific role? What's my direction? What am I working towards? How do I serve now in this moment? But also, what are you calling me to in the future? And how do I kind of live in both places? And that's a hard thing to do. So for some of us, honestly, like I think serving in the church and leading in the church is the greatest calling that you could have. Like it's a phenomenal thing. And I think for some of us, it wouldn't be enough because it's not what we're called to. And leading in the business world is the greatest calling that you could ask for. Or serving and leading in the school, or in a nursing home, or all these different places. Like where you're leading, what you're doing, like if that is your call, that is the best thing that you could ever give your life to. And if God is calling you to lead in a church, then that is the best thing that God could ever lead you to and you could ever lead your life to. Like, his call is what really matters in this. So for some of us, I think the church is a training ground for leadership, and we all lead in different ways here. I think for some of us, we just need to be supported by the church and serve in little ways so that we can lead outside of the church and be that other half of this thing. So, this section could be super long. I'm going to talk through this quickly because we could talk about this forever, but I don't want it to be just a couple practicals. If you lead in any church, in any setting, at all in the church, you should be doing it with humility, grace, and selflessness. That's what leadership should look like here. And I've seen, we've all seen in the news and things, so many church leaders who like rule with an iron fist and who come in and are like, get behind me, this is what we're doing, we're charging the gates and we're doing this thing, do it or hit the road. Like we see so many people like that. And that's just so dumb. like genuinely, seriously, it doesn't make sense in the church at all. When you think about it, like who's the head of the church? Jesus, right? God, yeah. It's not me. Like, thank God it's not me. Like, I am not that guy. Cody is not that guy. Like we are mid-level management at best. Like literally, God is the one deciding the future of our church. He's the one giving our church direction. He's the one telling our church where to plant and where to go. And at best, we are the ones trying to keep it from lighting on fire. Like that is what leaders do in the church. And if that's the case and we're actually letting God lead and we're not leading against him or trying to lead ahead of him and ask him to bless us, like if we are actually leading under him, then it kind of takes some of the pressure off, right? Like, and we become leaders who are just like walking with him and trying to be humble because we're mid-level leaders, we're mid-level management at best. So be humble, like realize that we are not God's gift to leadership. If you're a life group leader, you are not God's gift to life group. Like there's a lot of things you do well and a lot of things you do bad, every single life group. That's what it is, and I lead a life group, trust me. Part of it is being gracious. and realizing that this is a training ground for leadership, that this is a place where we have so much space for people to get it wrong. And when they get it wrong and they hurt us, we hug them and we move on. And we keep moving through it. And being selfless, realizing that we are not here to be followed, but to serve. That's what leadership is. And I love this quote by a guy named Simon Sinek. He's a business consultant, has incredible videos on leadership, not a Christian, but just like really understands what it means to lead. And he has this quote that says, "Leadership is not about being in charge, it's about taking care of those in your charge." So let me say that again. If you're a leader, write this down. Leadership is not about being in charge. Leadership is about taking care of those in your charge. That's powerful. The second thing here in this section on leading in the church is, if you lead in the church, you just need to know that the bar is higher for you. Especially if you are a pastor in the church, especially if you have this elder, overseer, shepherd role at some point in your life, like the bar is just higher. And luckily, we actually have like a very clear picture from Paul to Timothy of what the bar is, like very clear. But regardless of what level of leadership you're in, if you are the person who, when somebody walks through the doors, you hand them a card and say, "Welcome," you're a leader. Like, you are leading in that. Like, if you're running sound or video today, you are leading. If you were up here leading, you are leading. I hate to break that to you. Like, wherever you are, there is a bar that is higher than just person who shows up, because we are representing Jesus. And we specifically have the bar for this one position that we would call lead pastor here. This is in 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. And I want to point out too, like, as we talk about the relationship between Paul and Timothy, as we get farther into that story, we are literally like reading the discipleship of Paul to Timothy. Like, this is a discipleship session where he is writing a letter to him. And he says in verse 1 here, "Here's a trustworthy saying. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap." Now, I want to point out something, and again, if you're a pastor, read this very closely. If you are any other leader, read this pretty closely. You know, like, this is still a good thing to live up to. But I want to point out that this is not a list of skills. This is not a list of things to put on your resume. If you put these on your resume and apply to a business, they're going to laugh at you. Did you do that? Nice. Love it. Because the way that the world looks at leadership and the way that God looks at leadership are like polar opposites. God looks at the character, and the world usually looks at like the accolades. You know, the things, I did this, I led this, I did that. Like, God could care less about what you've done in the past. He cares about who you are today. He cares about your character. He cares about how you're living your life, how you're doing things, how you look like Jesus. And if you look at this list is just like one character thing after another. You know, even the ones that look like they're not character things really are. Like, it says, able to teach. It doesn't say best preacher on earth. Thank you, Jesus Christ. Because I would not be on that list. It just says able to teach. Like, and part of that is like living the life enough that you're not a hypocrite when you say the things. That's able to teach. It's able to get people to understand it. It's not amazingly eloquent and like super easy to understand. It's just able to teach. It says above reproach. Like, that is not a business genius who's like, you have to be like the best at making policies and procedures of anyone who's ever made like, it's not that. It's just be above reproach. Like, be so clearly you and so clearly in love with Jesus that when people call you out on things, everyone else is like, that can't be true. Like that's above reproach. It says be gentle. What Fortune 500 company is like, you know what kind of CEO we want? Gentle. No. Like every company on earth, every giant organization, like you don't ever hear anyone looking at somebody for president and being like, they're just so gentle. Like it's like somebody who's like strong is going to tell you what to do, and we're going to push you into submission, and we're going to sell more, and our bottom line's going to go up, and the money's going to go up, and you're going to make like, that's what the world's looking for. Jesus is looking at who's gentle, who's somebody that you just want to like bear hug from, It says he must manage his family well. That's actually something that the business world looks down on. If you care about your family, then you're probably not bringing enough money into the company. If you're not willing to leave them and go on massive week-long trips, then we don't want you. And Jesus is saying, no, like, if he doesn't care for his own family, how's he going to care for the family of the church? How's he going to care for my bride if he doesn't care for his? That's what he's looking at here. Like the things that connects all of this together, they're all just godly character. They're all looking and acting like Jesus. And I think I would submit to you, even just in the way that you follow leaders, but mostly the way that you lead, we're looking at the wrong things. We're looking for perfection. We're looking for being the best at this thing and the best at that thing. And I want, somebody who, when they speak, like you can just Instagram it so easily and put the little thing up there and like they have that quote that's awesome. Like that's not what God's looking for. And I think in whatever role that you're leading in the church, however you're leading in the church and through the church, don't go for the world standard of leadership. Go for his. Go for God's standard of leadership. He wants faithfulness. So if you serve in the church in any level, or you one day will serve in the church at any level, focus on faithfulness. That's what this needs to look like. And the third thing here I want to say really quick in this section before we move on is there's a difference between being a natural leader and being a leader. But I don't think it matters. I think it comes back to that faithfulness thing. It comes back to the obedience thing. Like, if you are a natural leader, it makes you a better leader, but it doesn't mean you're going to lead in the right direction. And if any of you are like afraid of this whole leadership thing and you're like, I don't know that I can do this and there's no way I'm equipped for this or anything like that, like I can teach you how to do the job, but I can't teach you to want character. Not really. Like you have to want it. Like you have to want to look like Jesus. You have to die to yourself. You have to push that stuff off to the side. And after that, I can teach you how to lead a ministry. That's the easy part. Focus on this. Like focus on the character of it. And then if you're a natural leader, fantastic, even better. If you're not, who cares? We'll teach it. So another thing that I want to talk about really quick, and I think another thing that kind of comes into this whole section is just dealing with conflict. So do me a favor, don't make too much eye contact, don't make it weird. Look at everyone around you really quick. Just look around. Conflict is inevitable. Those are crazy people you just looked at. If you're looking at me like I'm a little off, like it's okay. Like we can just say it. This church is so different. Like we are different in race and gender and socioeconomic level and where we're from and how we do things and how we speak to each other and like just all of it. And that's so good. Like that's great. Like that's my favorite thing about this group. And when you bring in the other half of our church on the west side, like we are a mixed bunch. It's fantastic. But also that means that we're going to be in some conflict at times. And conflict is not a bad thing, When we look at the verse talking about iron sharpening iron, like that doesn't happen comfortably. When God sharpens us and he turns us into better versions of ourselves by rubbing up against people around us, by people changing who we are and taking off little bits of metal and sharpening us, like it is uncomfortable, it hurts, it's awkward, but it's good. So being a leader is handling that conflict, is being able to fix it among other people, but also being able to fix it with ourselves and the people that we're in conflict with. And it's a good thing. Like if we completely avoid conflict and sweep it under the rug, it'll just blow up later. It doesn't fix anything. So dealing with conflict is an important thing. And actually, again, when we look at the discipleship between Paul and Timothy in 1st and 2nd Timothy, which is just 2 sessions of their discipleship, we see so much conflict resolution. Like that's what so much of these books are. And I love how he kind of jumps in here in 2 Timothy 2:14. Paul says to Timothy, keep reminding God's people of these things. Warn them before God about quarreling about words. It's of no value and only ruins those who listen. So the church is fighting about words. And I think we could get into the theological differences where we're like, well, they were fighting for this and they were fighting for this. Obviously they're right and they're like, but Paul doesn't even get into that. He doesn't care. He's like, they're fighting and it's destroying them. Like they're quarreling, they're dealing with this stuff, they're quarreling about words, it's of no value. And he says, focus on these things. And the things he's talking about, he had just said earlier here in verses 11 through 13. I want to read those to you. This is what he says focus on. 2 Timothy 2, 11 through 13. I put it in the notes wrong, so it's probably not going to be right on the screen. I'm sorry. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will also disown us. If we're faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. It's pointing out the character of God. Like the character of God is what we focus on. And when things hit the fan and you want to strangle the person next to you, great, it's going to happen. We're humans. Focus on the character of Jesus. And realize who he is and how he heals those things. Point out the things that are wrong, point them back to Jesus and help them see the big picture. But let's walk through this together. And he also says this a little bit deeper to Timothy, again in 2 Timothy, because for some weird reason, the conflict didn't stop between 1st and 2 Timothy. Like, I don't know, the first letter didn't work. I'm just kidding, that's not true. But it's inevitable in the church. Like, it just keeps going. And we see this in verse 24. It says, and the Lord's servant, Timothy, must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape the trap of the devil who is taking them captive to do his will. There is so much patience that is necessary in leadership. Like if you are a leader in the church, you have to be the most patient person. And again, I mean every person who is discipling somebody, every person who has kids, every person who hands out a card or is holding an iPad right now, everyone who's ever played a guitar up here or spoken up here, everybody. If you are leading in the church, if you are doing anything representing Jesus, you have to be so patient because people suck so much. And I've been that person that sucks so much, and I'm so sorry, but I was there. And please be patient with me, and I'll be patient with you. And like that's what this looks like, to work through conflict together, is to continually give each other the benefit of the doubt and just walk through this together. You know, not being quarrelsome, but being kind to everybody, able to teach, still giving. This is the truth of what God says, but not being resentful. And I think that changes so much about us. So to close this really quick, this whole sermon series, we've always closed every sermon with 2 things. It's been, how do I be discipled in this? And how do I disciple somebody else in this? And this one is very simple. It's very straightforward. I want you to hear this, okay? So to be discipled in leadership development, work on your character, discover your calling, be faithful in that calling, and then keep growing and learning. Get help from your discipler. That's it. Yeah, I know, right? Super easy. Ellie can do it. like that's what this is. Seriously, like I know there's like this big fear of leadership. I know there's this thing of like, oh, I've got this big ominous thing. Like the bar is higher. We talked about that. Yes, you have to be that character. It's hard to figure out your calling and try and go after the things that God's called you to do. But at the end of the day, this is leadership. Like work on your character, discover your calling, be faithful in that calling, and then keep growing and learning. And no matter what level you're at of leadership, you keep growing and learning. And you keep just moving forward. So then, this is really confusing. It goes a different way, but to be discipling somebody else in leadership, you help them work on their calling. You help them you help them work on their character. You help them discover their calling. You help them be faithful in that calling, and then you help them grow and learn. I know, it's shocking, right? Like, it's hard to even get that in words. But again, like, so much of this comes down to this, like, don't mix up what leadership is. Don't be so captivated with leadership should be, I'm controlling this and I'm leading this and I have all this stuff under control and I've got my calendar done and leadership is character. Leadership is influence. And if we're doing this in discipleship, we're just looking out for the other person and walking through it with them. Because again, I'll say this again, good leadership can either make or break a church. Like, great leaders will either cause a church to thrive or to burn. But obedient leaders, it can only go forward. Like, it can only go in a good direction. It might go slower because we need to learn some of the practicals, but it's going to go in the right direction. So in discipleship, that's what it is. It's encouraging them to do that. It's helping them do that. It's helping them walk out in it. So as the worship team comes back up here, I want to say one more thing kind of about this. In my life, like, I've walked through a lot of this stuff. I don't know what your background is in church, and I think depending on what church you've been a part of, like, you probably see my role very differently. If you've been a part of a mega church, you probably have like that's the pastor. If you've been a part of a church of like 20 people, you're like, that's Doug, and everything in between, and that's okay. But I just want to let you know, like, I'm just some dude. That's it. Like, it's not worth looking at me and being like, oh, like, that's Yale, he's the pet. Like, I am not trying to live a godly character because I'm a pastor. God called me to be a pastor because I devoted my entire life to trying to live godly character. Like that's it. I'm not up here because of my accolades. I'm not up here because I'm the best speaker on earth or the prettiest. I'm not up here. It's fair. I'm not up here because of anything that I bring to the table, except that I just want to follow Jesus, And I think whatever role you're in and whatever you're doing, like, you got to stop thinking that I'm going for perfection. Like, what you're doing is you are following perfection so closely that you can't miss. You yourself are not going to be perfect. Like, this comes back to the view of what it looks like to follow a rabbi. In the first sermon in this series, we talked about following a rabbi so closely that the dirt gets kicked up on you. Leadership is following him so closely that the person following you can't help but also follow him because you're so close to him. When we start going off and we start trying to do our own thing and we start trying to make our own calling because we want to make waves in the Christian community or I want to make the best business there is and I'll tithe off of it. And like, when we start going our own direction, we completely miss it. But when we are like on the heels of Jesus and we are walking with people that we care about who are on our heels, like, we cannot miss. That's leadership. That's what this is supposed to look like. So whatever fear you have or whatever, intrepidation of like, I don't think I can do this, like, fantastic, you can't. But you're following so closely at the feet of the one who can that it's going to work. And that's what God's calling us to. He's not calling us to reinvent the wheel. He's not calling us to make the best nonprofit for trafficking victims ever. He's not calling us to like do the best youth group that has ever existed. He's not calling us to hand out cards in a way where people are like, what must I do to be saved? Like, all he's asking us to do is to follow so closely behind him that where he leads, we follow, and where we go, they follow. That's leadership. And every single one of us has to invest in that. And if you're a natural leader, all the more so. Go hard after Jesus. Be influential. Be somebody worth following. And that's where the church explodes, right? That's where our little plans are this big, but his plans are huge, and we can't even see where they go. But he's smart. He knows what he's doing. So when you guys came, you should have gotten one of those cards, the connection card, if you want to pull that out really quick. Otherwise, you can also do it on the app. You can just scroll to the bottom of the sermon notes. You can click the little connection card button. But there's 3 things on here I want to point out. The first thing says, I'll seek God for my calling in this season and take steps of obedience now. Again, you are not asking God for steps 30 years from now. Just focus on like Tuesday. You know, like, what do you want me to do between now and Tuesday? Yeah, Tuesday. That's it. 3 days.
No.
2 days.
1,000 days.
Math. Well, there is probably a Tuesday in 1,000 days. You're not wrong. But let's focus on what God's doing now, you know, and just ask God for steps in that. The second thing here is I need to be more intentional about helping somebody I disciple develop into a leader. And I think, again, like, if you are discipling somebody who is already a leader, it's really easy to see how to get them to the next step. But if you're just discipling somebody, a lot of times you forget, like, God is calling that person to lead in some way, shape, or form. The question is just where. So how do I develop these people into leaders? And the third thing is, here are the ways I need to work on my leadership. And that might just be realizing I'm a leader. That might just be actually like focusing on the people that are following me. It might be I'm not close enough to the feet of Jesus to have anyone follow me right now. But whatever it is, let's make some steps and work on it. So God, that's our cry for you today. That's our plea for you today, is that we wouldn't walk out of this place leading in our own ability. That we'd stop pointing to a degree on the wall and say, see, I know how to do it. That we'd stop pointing to our years of experience, because you don't really care where we've been. You care where we are. You care how faithful we've been. You care how much we've loved people. You care how much we've been selfless and humble. God, I just pray that you would make us into leaders, that you would make this church influential people. That in whatever world that is, in whatever area that is, I pray that you would spread us out. I pray that we would be influential in different places, that we would be influential in different groups. God, make us leaders who lead so closely to your heels that we've got people behind us too. Lord, I just pray a blessing right now over every discipleship relationship that's represented here. It's represented right now through these people. Lord, I just pray that we would see the future for them, that we would see where they could go, that we would see the abilities, we would see the character, we would see the devotion to their King, and that we would call those things out and say, hey, have you ever thought about this? Lord, I pray that we would be not just heroes, but hero makers, that we would be people who develop leaders and who see God move in incredible ways. God, we thank you that you choose to use us. And Lord, I thank you that you're not looking for a CEO type, but you're looking for a Jesus type. Make us into that, please. Make us look more like you, God. We love you.